Suggs-Anderson, and I am a consumer safety officer with the infant formula and medical food staff. While I work extensively with the reviews of incoming infant formula notifications, I am also the primary contact person regarding medical foods issues. I wanted to take this time to briefly talk to you about the regulation of medical foods. Now, my main objectives and topics to review with you today are the following: history, what is a medical food, and what are the regulations and labeling requirements that apply to medical foods. But first, we're going to have our first poll question. How long have medical foods been on the market? Over 20 years, over 30, or over 40 years? I'll let you all ponder that just for a moment and we'll move on. Frequently, you can't understand and know where you currently are and where your path may lead you until you know and understand where you've been. So we'll start with a bit of history. The idea of specially formulated foods for seriously ill patients is not new. Since the 1940s, special foods have been developed, and in 1941, FDA proposed the first definition for foods for special dietary use, or FSDUs. Before 1972, medical foods were regulated as drugs. An example of a product was called lofenolac. It's a product that was low in phenylalanine. It mitigated serious adverse effects of phenylketonuria, or PKU, had a straightforward formulation. Its safe use was assured due to physician supervision, and the scientific principles were clear with adequate testing for efficacy. Now let's look at our results for the first poll question. Well, it looks like 8 people answered, and out of those 8, 7 answered that it was over 20 years that they've been on the market. Well, actually, medical foods, as we've come to know the product category, have been on the market for over 40 years. The term medical foods was first coined in 1973. However, the product that I mentioned, lofenolac, had been on the market for some time prior to 1973. However, in late 1972, FDA made the decision to remove medical foods from the drug category to be regulated as a food for special dietary use. Why was this done? It was done because the usefulness of such products was widely accepted, they were in limited supply, and research, development, and review was costly and time-consuming, as it typically is with research and development of drugs, of new drugs. Now, our next poll question is, can medical foods make health claims? An example of the definition of health claim is any claim that's associated with the reduction of disease risk. So yes or no? Now, in 1973, there was a preamble to the final rule on nutrition labeling, and within this document, 2 types of foods for special dietary use were exempted from the general nutrition labeling requirements. This is also when and where the term medical foods came into being. 15 years later, in 1988, by way of the Orphan Drug Amendments, the statutory definition of medical foods was created. And this definition is as follows: a food which is formulated to be consumed or administered enterally under the supervision of a physician, and which is intended for the specific dietary management of a disease or condition for which distinctive nutritional requirements based on recognized scientific principles are established by medical evaluation. Now, I hope I've given you all at least a little extra time to answer the second poll question. But to answer whether or not medical foods can make health claims, actually the answer is no. And it looks like 72% of you said yes, while the remaining of you said no. Well, the reason for this is that you have to think about the intent of use of a medical food. The intent of use of a medical food is to manage a particular disease. So if a health claim, which is typically used for the generally healthy population, is to reduce the risk of even getting a disease, it's difficult to see how a health claim can be made for a medical food because you cannot reduce the risk of a disease that you already have. In 1990, the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, or NLEA, came into being. Specifically for medical foods, it exempted them from the requirements for nutrition labeling and health and nutrient content claims. This basically means that medical foods don't have to adhere to the nutrition facts format. Additionally, although medical foods are exempted from the requirements of making health claims typically cannot be made for medical foods. Again, a product can't reduce the risk of a disease that it's intended to manage. Medical foods are also exempted from the requirements for making nutrient content claims. However, any nutrient content claim would need to be germane to the disease for which the product is intended to manage. For example, the product label can't indicate that the product is sucrose-free if being sucrose-free has nothing to do with the product's intent of use. NLEA also identified 5 criteria to clarify characteristics of medical foods. So in order to be able to label a product as a medical food, it would have to satisfy all of these 5 criteria. Now the third poll question is as follows. Are medical foods one or more of the following? All tube feeding products, oral nutritional supplements, parenteral nutrition, and that would be total parenteral nutrition or peripheral parenteral nutrition, none of the above, all of the above, or 1 and 2. The 5 criteria to clarify the characteristics of medical food. These criteria are mutually inclusive and attempt to clarify what a medical food is in addition to the statutory definition. I've highlighted key elements of each criterion to briefly discuss. It is specially formulated, this is the first criteria. It is specially formulated and processed product as opposed to a naturally occurring foodstuff used in its natural state for the partial or exclusive feeding of a patient by means of oral intake or enteral feeding by tube. Now, specially formulated and processed product, an example of how this would not qualify would be something like an apple or any processed apple. It would not qualify. And when we look at the part of the first criterion, partial or exclusive feeding of a patient by means of oral intake or enteral feeding by tube, that would certainly exclude any route of administration other than that of the gastrointestinal tract. Now, criterion 2, it is intended for the dietary management of a patient who, because of therapeutic or chronic medical needs, has limited or impaired capacity to ingest, digest, absorb, or metabolize ordinary foodstuffs or certain nutrients, or who has other special medically determined nutrient requirements, the dietary management of which cannot be achieved by the modification of the normal diet alone. This criterion is very significant. While it has to tie into a particular disease or condition based on the statutory definition, it also requires that the diet cannot be modified to similarly manage the individual. So, as an example, a person that requires a tube feeding product because of a closed head injury, stroke, or post-op, that product wouldn't qualify as a medical food because food can be blenderized and a multivitamin supplement added to it to meet the same or similar needs, which is exactly what used to be done with tube feedings years ago. This criterion does not speak to convenience or compliance, only whether the diet can be modified. Now, the third criterion, it provides nutritional support specifically modified for the management of the unique nutrient needs that result from the specific disease or condition, as determined by medical evaluation. This speaks to the specialized product modified to meet the unique nutrient needs that arise from the associated disease or condition. And the last two criteria are fairly self-explanatory. It is intended to be used under medical supervision, and it is intended only for a patient receiving active and ongoing medical supervision wherein the patient requires medical care on a recurring basis for, among other things, instructions on the use of the medical food. Now, after removal from the drug product category, the number of medical foods marketed began to increase. By the early 1990s, it was estimated there were over 300 products on the market, compared to only one prior to 1972. This increase prompted the publication of an advance notice of proposed rulemaking for medical foods in 1996. Its primary purpose was to clarify the definition of a medical food and to provide for some substantiation of nutritional efficacy and claims. The public was asked for comments. However, in 2003, 7 years following the publication of the ANPR, the medical foods ANPR was withdrawn due to inactivity, lack of resources, and a change in priorities. This action, however, did not mean that the majority of the opinions expressed in that document had changed. Well, in looking at the results for the third poll question, it doesn't look like too many people attempted to answer it. Well, it looks as if some folks answered A, as in that, at least the way I'm interpreting that, all tube feeding products are medical foods, and then only one person out of the 5 commented that oral nutrition supplements are medical foods. Well, options 3 and 5 are eliminated, obviously, because parenteral nutrition is regulated as a drug. 1 is eliminated because of the use of the word all. All tube feeding products wouldn't qualify as medical foods, just by virtue of them being tube feeding products. And 2 would generally be eliminated, that being oral nutrition supplements, because of the intent of use to supplement the diet due to lack of disease association. So the correct answer, again, generally speaking, is 4, none of the above. So what is a medical food? FDA considers there to be a narrow interpretation of the statutory definition. Fourth poll question, must ingredients be approved for use in medical foods? Always or not always, / it depends. To elaborate on the agency's interpretation, medical foods are not for broad-based use or to make health claims. Statements related to reduction of disease risks, such as consuming more calcium, may reduce your risk of osteoporosis. Medical foods are specially formulated and processed and constitute a major management approach to a specific disease or condition. A product is not a medical food just because it's given to sick or ill persons. What regulations apply to medical foods? Medical foods are regulated as are other foods under the provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. It just basically means that all manufacturers of medical foods are responsible for ensuring that the food is not adulterated or misbranded. Results of the next poll question would be not always, and it depends, and it looks like most of you answered in that way. Additionally, under the Act, medical foods must comply with all applicable requirements for the manufacture of foods, namely CGMPs, good manufacturing practices, etc. And we'll have to skip the next couple of poll questions. Ingredients used in medical foods are also subject to regulation. They must be approved food additives for their intended use or a food additive that is the subject of an exemption for investigational use if the ingredients are not GRAS. Labeling requirements that apply to medical foods. They must contain the same information as for foods. Additional labeling requirements are pretty much the same. They have to appear with prominence and conspicuousness and be in English. Do medical foods have to be approved or registered with FDA? Medical foods do not undergo pre-market review or approval by FDA, since there is no regulation or law requiring pre-market review and/or approval. While the products themselves don't have to be registered with FDA, the manufacturing facility plants must be registered. And are medical food manufacturing plants inspected? They are inspected bi-yearly unless the product is also intended for use as an infant formula, then the plant is inspected annually. And FDA has a compliance program that provides guidance to FDA inspectors for the inspection of medical foods manufacturing plants. Future directions for medical foods, well, it's dependent upon resources and priorities. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We're really going to need to move on to our next presentation. Our time, by my timing device, is supposed to start right at 12:30, and that is where we are at the moment. So thank you, Dr. Becker and Ms. Suggs-Anderson.